They say owning property gives you freedom, until the HOA decides it doesn't. At least that's what I thought when the first warning letter appeared in my mailbox. Excessive vehicle presence on property, violation of community guidelines. I stared at the page, my pulse quickening. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. My cars were neatly parked on my own land. Not on the street, not blocking anyone's driveway, just sitting in my driveway and garage. Still, I decided to handle it calmly. I sent a polite email to the HOA explaining the situation. Simple misunderstanding, right? Wrong. A week later, a second letter arrived. This time, it wasn't a warning. It was a notice. Due to continued violations, your HOA fees have been increased by 20% effective immediately. My stomach twisted. Increased fees over cars parked on my own property? This was beyond frustrating. But as I would soon discover, the HOA had no idea who they were dealing with. I tried reaching out directly to the HOA board, hoping a conversation would clear things up. No response. Days passed, and my frustration grew. I knew I had followed every rule in the community guidelines. My vehicles weren't unsightly, abandoned, or causing any disruptions. Yet they singled me out. Why? I couldn't shake the feeling that this was personal. Then came the unexpected encounters. Board members driving past my house more frequently, slowing down as if to inspect my property. The air around my home felt heavier, like unseen eyes watched my every move. I had heard whispers from neighbors about the HOA's overreach, but until now, I hadn't experienced it firsthand. Now it was clear they intended to make an example out of me. That evening, as I sat on my porch, a flicker of determination replaced my initial frustration. I wouldn't let the HOA dictate how I use my property, especially when I knew I was within my rights. The next steps wouldn't just be about clearing my name. I was going to show them that their authority had limits, and that I had more power than they realized. This was only the beginning. Over the next few days, subtle but deliberate changes unfolded around the neighborhood. HOA board members began driving by more frequently, their cars slowing as they passed my house. I noticed their glances, quick but purposeful, as if taking mental notes. The air around my property seemed to hum with unseen scrutiny, a constant reminder that I was under watch. Then one afternoon, I spotted her, Karen, the head of the HOA. She stood across the street, clipboard clutched tightly, her gaze fixed on my driveway like a hawk sizing up prey. The faint scratch of her pen echoed faintly as she jotted something down, her posture rigid with silent judgment. I stepped outside, wiping my hands on my jeans as I approached the edge of my property. My pulse remained steady, though the heat of frustration simmered beneath the surface. "Is there a problem, Karen?" I asked, keeping my voice calm but firm. She turned slowly, her smile polite but strained. "Oh, just conducting a routine neighborhood check," she replied, her tone light with a veneer of forced friendliness. "You know how important it is to maintain the aesthetics of our community." My jaw tightened as I met her gaze head-on. "Everything on my property is within the rules," I stated plainly. Karen's eyes flicked back toward my driveway, her smile unwavering but her eyes sharp. "We've received complaints about the number of cars parked here," she said, her voice dipping into something more pointed. "It disrupts the visual harmony of the neighborhood. We strive to maintain a certain standard." I stepped closer, holding her gaze without flinching. "Every car is legally registered and parked on private property. Nothing in the HOA guidelines prohibits that," I replied evenly. Her smile never wavered, though her fingers tensed slightly around the clipboard. "Perhaps," she allowed, her tone edged with condescension, "but the board reserves the right to enforce measures that benefit the community as a whole. Just something to keep in mind." We stood there in silence for a moment, the unspoken challenge hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Karen turned, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement as she walked away, shoulders squared with a sense of authority she clearly relished. I watched her retreat, my fists clenching at my sides. Let them watch. Let them count my cars. If the HOA thought they could intimidate me into compliance, they were in for a rude awakening. This was my property, and I wasn't backing down. The next letter arrived with a tone sharper than the last. "Continued violations will result in additional fee increases and potential legal action." My patience snapped. This wasn't about maintaining the community, it was about control. The HOA believed they could push me into compliance through intimidation, but what they didn't know was that I wasn't just another homeowner. Years ago, I had invested strategically, purchasing several properties throughout the neighborhood. Quietly, without fanfare, I had built a portfolio of rental homes occupied by families who respected the community and took pride in their homes. Many of those families had shared stories of the HOA's overreach, unwarranted fines, nitpicking inspections, and arbitrary rules designed to maintain control rather than support residents. I had listened, offering support where I could, but now the fight had come to my doorstep, and I intended to respond. I placed the letter on my desk, smoothing the creases with deliberate care. Their threats might have intimidated someone else, but not me. I had the resources, knowledge, and influence to turn the tables. The HOA had made a critical mistake by assuming I was powerless, and I intended to teach them a lesson they wouldn't forget. That evening, I retrieved every letter, email, and notice I had received from the HOA, placing them in a folder alongside photographs of my property, each image showcasing cars neatly parked within legal limits. I reviewed the HOA bylaws, searching for loopholes and clauses that might work in my favor. It didn't take long to find what I needed. Buried in the legal jargon was a clause detailing voting rights within the HOA. Each property owner held one vote, but those who owned multiple properties held a vote for each property they owned. With my portfolio, I held more votes than most board members combined. A slow smile crossed my face as the pieces of my plan began falling into place. This wasn't just about defending my rights, it was about restoring fairness and accountability for every resident the HOA had mistreated. Their threats had lit a fire within me, and I was prepared to use every tool at my disposal to fight back. This wasn't a battle I intended to lose. First, I reached out to the tenants of the properties I owned, explaining the situation. Their responses were immediate and supportive. Many shared their own stories of unreasonable fines, surprise inspections, and nitpicky complaints. Together, we documented every instance of HOA harassment, letters, warnings, unexplained fees, building a comprehensive record of their overreach. Next, I started attending HOA meetings. I had rarely gone before, never had a reason to, but now I made sure to sit right up front, watching as Karen and her board tried to maintain control. Their eyes occasionally flicked toward me, but they didn't recognize me as anything more than a single homeowner. Not yet. At one meeting, Karen stood at the podium, droning on about maintaining neighborhood standards and ensuring visual harmony, the usual rhetoric designed to justify their heavy-handed tactics. I waited until she paused before raising my hand. Yes? Karen asked, her smile strained as she adjusted her clipboard. I'd like to discuss the recent fee increases and how the board interprets vehicle regulations, I said, my voice calm but firm. Her smile tightened. Fees are adjusted as necessary to uphold community values and maintain property aesthetics. She replied smoothly, her practiced tone betraying no emotion. And who decides what's necessary? I pressed. Because the HOA guidelines don't specify limits on vehicles parked on private property. Karen's eyes narrowed slightly. The board has discretion to enforce measures that benefit the community as a whole, she said. It's about preserving the neighborhood's character. Interesting, I replied, leaning back in my chair with deliberate ease. And what about board members selectively enforcing rules to target specific residents? Is that also considered preserving character? A murmur rippled through the room. Karen's smile didn't falter, but her gaze flicked nervously toward the other board members. One of them shifted uncomfortably in their seat. I let the tension hang in the air for a moment, allowing the weight of my words to settle. Then, without another word, I leaned back, offering a calm but unwavering stare. I could see the unease beginning to creep into Karen's eyes. She didn't know it yet, but the power dynamic had already begun to shift. This was only the beginning, and I was just getting started. A week later, I made my move. At the next HOA meeting, I arrived with a stack of documents, property deeds, correspondence records, and a list of tenants willing to testify about HOA harassment. I could feel the weight of the folder in my hands, a tangible reminder of the power I held. As the meeting began, I stood, clearing my throat to capture the room's attention. Before we continue, I have something to share, I announced. My voice was calm but carried a firmness that silenced the scattered conversations. For those who don't know, I own several properties within this neighborhood. Karen's smile faltered. Her clipboard clutched a little tighter. That's unexpected, she managed, though her tone had lost its usual confidence. Maybe to you, I replied smoothly, stepping forward. But it's relevant because, as a property owner, I have a vested interest in how this community is governed. And I've documented numerous instances of selective enforcement, unreasonable fees, and harassment from the HOA board. Karen's face paled. Now wait just a minute. I raised a hand, silencing her mid-sentence. I'm not finished. I let my gaze sweep across the room, meeting the eyes of each board member in turn. Under HOA bylaws, property owners have voting rights proportional to the number of properties owned, which means I hold a significant share of votes in this neighborhood. Gasps echoed through the room. Board members exchanged nervous glances, the confidence they had wielded so easily beginning to waver. So here's what's going to happen, I continued, placing the stack of documents on the table with a deliberate thud. First, the increased fees against my property and any other unjustified fines will be rescinded immediately. Second, the HOA will cease its excessive surveillance and selective enforcement. And third, any future decisions impacting residents will be subject to a transparent voting process that involves the entire community. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her eyes flicked to her fellow board members, seeking support that wasn't there. And if these conditions aren't met, I added, holding up a section of the bylaws, I'm prepared to pursue legal action for harassment and breach of contract. And trust me, the court won't look kindly on an HOA that abuses its authority. Silence settled over the room like a heavy blanket. I stepped back, the echo of my words lingering in the air. The power dynamic had shifted, and they all knew it. The fallout was swift and decisive. Within days, the fee increase was officially rescinded. Letters of apology were mailed to residents who had been unfairly fined, each envelope carrying an implicit admission of the HOA's overreach. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, whispers of what had transpired at the meeting, of how one homeowner had stood up to the board and won. As for Karen, her resignation came swiftly. The pressure had been too much. The accusations of selective enforcement, the evidence of harassment, and the threat of legal action had shattered her reputation. Her name became synonymous with overreach and abuse of power, a cautionary tale shared in hushed conversations between neighbors. Without her iron grip, the HOA's stranglehold on the community began to loosen. With my voting power, I played a key role in electing a new board, one committed to fairness, transparency, and genuine community support. Gone were the days of arbitrary fines and surprise inspections. Residents who had once whispered their frustrations now spoke openly, unafraid of retaliation. The change was palpable. Children played more freely in front yards. Neighbors gathered more often for casual conversations, and the air seemed lighter, as though the neighborhood had collectively exhaled a breath it hadn't realized it had been holding. But perhaps the most satisfying victory was the simplest one. My cars, each one legally registered and neatly parked, remained right where they belonged. No more warning letters appeared in my mailbox. No more slow-moving cars lingered in front of my house. And Karen's clipboard no longer made its unwelcome appearances across the street. I could finally enjoy my property without feeling like I was under constant surveillance. One afternoon, as I stood at the edge of my driveway, watching the sun dip below the horizon, a neighbor approached me. "I heard what you did," he said, his voice low but warm. "Thank you for standing up to them. It's different now. Better." I simply nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. "Someone had to do it," I replied, because in the end, the HOA learned a simple lesson, one they wouldn't soon forget. You don't mess with the person who owns the neighborhood. Just when I thought the ordeal was over, a letter appeared in my mailbox. Anonymous, but unmistakably from Karen. The message was short but clear. "This isn't over." The words were scrawled hastily in thick, black ink, as if written in anger. I stared at the note, the faint scent of cheap perfume clinging to the paper. A signature detail I recognized from her past correspondence. I crumpled the letter in my hand, a surge of frustration rising within me. I should have known Karen wouldn't go quietly. Her resignation from the HOA might have stripped her of official power, but her need for control clearly hadn't diminished. Still, I had come too far to let her petty games shake me. Over the next week, strange occurrences began to unfold, subtle yet deliberate. Trash cans mysteriously tipped over, their contents scattered across my lawn as if by unseen hands. Deep tire tracks appeared in the grass along the edge of my property, leaving muddy ruts that marred the otherwise neat landscaping. On several occasions, I spotted shadowy figures lingering near my driveway, after dusk. Never close enough to be identified, but just near enough to unnerve me. The tension crept into my daily life, a nagging awareness that I was being watched. Yet this time, I refused to be intimidated. Karen might have believed she could wear me down with petty harassment, but she had underestimated my resolve. I had faced her head-on before, and I was prepared to do so again. Determined to put an end to the games, I reinforced my property's security measures. Additional motion sensor lights were installed along the perimeter, casting harsh beams of light on anyone who dared to approach after dark. My security cameras were upgraded to capture clearer footage, leaving no room for shadows to hide. I documented every incident, ensuring that I had a record should legal action become necessary. Days passed without another letter, but the sense of anticipation lingered. I knew Karen was waiting, testing my limits, searching for a crack in my defenses. But as I stood on my porch one evening, surveying my well-lit property and listening to the hum of my security system, I allowed myself a small smile. This time, I was ready. Whatever Karen had planned next, I would be prepared to meet it head-on. After all, she had already learned once that I wasn't someone to be underestimated. If she wanted a last stand, I was more than ready to finish what she had started. After the string of petty incidents, I decided it was time to catch Karen red-handed. I upgraded my security system, adding extra cameras equipped with motion detection and night vision. I placed them strategically around my property, above the garage, near the driveway, and along the fence line, ensuring no corner was left unwatched. Each device was connected to my phone, allowing me to monitor my property in real time and capture any suspicious activity. It didn't take long before I got what I needed. Late one night, a notification buzzed on my phone. Motion detected near garage. Heart pounding, I opened the live feed and watched as a shadow crept along the edge of my property. The figure paused near my trash cans, hesitated, then tipped them over with a quick shove. Bags burst open, spilling their contents across the lawn. The figure crouched, taping a piece of paper to my garage door before retreating into the darkness. But the cameras didn't miss a thing. The night vision lens captured her face clearly as she glanced toward the camera. A moment of realization flickering in her eyes as she recognized she'd been caught. Karen. The next morning, I reviewed the footage, ensuring the images were sharp and unmistakable. With the evidence saved to my phone, I headed to the local police station. Filing the report was surprisingly simple. The officers listened attentively as I explained the history of harassment and presented the video. One officer leaned closer to the screen, raising an eyebrow. "Clear as day," he said. "We'll take care of it." Within days, squad cars appeared in front of Karen's house. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, their whispers carrying through the air as uniformed officers knocked on her door. She answered, her face pale as she spotted the police. Words were exchanged, her protest growing louder, but the evidence left no room for denial. Moments later, an officer gestured her toward the squad car, and she had no choice but to comply. The sight of Karen being questioned on her front porch became the talk of the neighborhood. People gathered in small groups, exchanging hushed conversations that carried a mixture of surprise and satisfaction. Her carefully crafted image of authority and control crumbled in an instant, leaving only the undeniable truth. She had crossed a line and was now facing the consequences. Watching from my porch, I exhaled slowly, the weight of weeks of stress lifting from my shoulders. I had played her game, and I had won. But something told me this wasn't the last I'd hear of Karen. Not yet. The legal process moved swiftly, faster than I had anticipated. Armed with my video evidence and statements from neighbors who had also experienced Karen's harassment, the case against her was airtight. During the preliminary hearing, her lawyer attempted to downplay her actions, claiming they were minor incidents blown out of proportion. But the footage told a different story. clear, undeniable proof of her trespassing, vandalism, and intimidation. The judge's expression remained stern as the evidence was presented, each piece stacking up like bricks in a wall Karen couldn't break through. When my neighbors took the stand, their testimonies painted a picture of a woman whose need for control had crossed legal boundaries. Some spoke of threats, others of unexplained property damage that had gone unreported out of fear of retaliation. Their words carried weight, reinforcing that Karen's actions weren't isolated. They were part of a pattern of intimidation and abuse. When it was my turn to testify, I spoke calmly, detailing the escalation of harassment that had begun with anonymous notes and petty vandalism, but had culminated in trespassing and criminal mischief. I emphasized that despite my attempts to resolve the situation peacefully, Karen had chosen to escalate the conflict. I held nothing back. My words were measured, but my intent was clear. I wanted the court to understand that this wasn't a case of a neighborly dispute gone wrong. It was about holding someone accountable for violating both the law and the trust of an entire community. The judge listened intently, then turned to Karen. Her shoulders were hunched, her gaze fixed on the floor. When asked if she had anything to say, she mumbled something about misunderstanding boundaries. But it was too little, too late. The evidence had spoken louder than any excuse she could offer. In the end, the ruling was decisive. The court issued a restraining order, barring Karen from approaching my property or contacting me in any way. Any future violation would result in criminal charges. But the consequences didn't stop there. News of the trial spread quickly through the neighborhood and beyond. Whispers of her behavior reached her workplace, where she soon faced disciplinary action for conduct unbecoming of her position. Her professional reputation, once solid, began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. Karen's world, once built on control and intimidation, had collapsed, and as I left the courthouse that day, I knew she would never regain the power she had so desperately clung to. The battle was over, and justice had finally been served. With Karen out of the picture, the neighborhood transformed almost overnight. The tension that had once hung over our streets seemed to evaporate. The newly elected HOA board, now composed of fair-minded individuals, upheld reasonable policies that respected everyone's rights. The days of arbitrary fines and surprise inspections were over. My tenants expressed their relief openly. One by one, they shared how they no longer lived in fear of receiving unwarranted citations or being watched from across the street. They could enjoy their homes without the shadow of the HOA looming over them. I took pride in knowing that my stand against the board had not only secured my own freedom, but had also helped others feel more at ease in their daily lives. Neighbors who had once kept their frustrations to themselves began to reconnect. Children played freely in their yards, unbothered by nitpicking complaints about noise or stray toys. Front porches, once places of quiet observation, became gathering spots where people exchanged friendly conversations without fear of judgment. It was as if a collective weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. As for my property, the transformation was even more profound. No longer did cars slow as they passed by my driveway, and the once frequent surveillance from board members had ceased entirely. My cars, each one legally registered and neatly parked, remained right where they belonged. I took satisfaction in seeing them there, a silent testament to the battle I had won. No more warning letters, no more threats, just the quiet, undeniable proof that I had reclaimed my space on my own terms. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues across the neighborhood, I stood on my front porch taking it all in. The air felt lighter, the sounds of laughter and distant conversations drifting through the air. I allowed myself a moment of reflection, savoring the peace that had returned not just to my home, but to the entire community. Victory had never tasted so sweet, not because I had defeated the HOA, but because I had restored a sense of fairness and respect that everyone deserved. And as I glanced toward my driveway, a smile tugged at the corner of my lips. Those cars, parked proudly in their rightful place, served as a lasting reminder of one simple truth: never underestimate the person who truly owns the neighborhood.